Hello, everybody. My name is Lindsay, and today I'm going to be doing a literary review for a paper titled Got Seeds Strengthening the Reforestation Pipeline in the Western United States. It's a good one. Now, I've done other literary reviews on this channel, um, but typically what I try to do is just represent the paper exactly as it's written. Um, Essentially, just like a watered down synopsis or an outline, perhaps. This paper is different in the sense that this is literally what I do for work. This is what I'm obsessed about. I think about the seeds daily. And, in the end of this paper, it calls for, a need for more discourse between the different links in the reforestation chain. And I am the forester link, the boots on the ground, the people getting the seeds. So what I'm going to do is kind of give my perspective as a forester who works for the United States Forest Service, but also cover the paper exactly how it is. And I'm going to do my best to represent the paper how it's written, and then be clear when it's me talking. So bear with me. In short, this paper is about reforesting the Western United States. It talks about the backlog of acreage that exists. It talks about how we procure seeds, the issues that we have in procuring those seeds. And it presents, most importantly, it presents solutions to the issues that we face currently. So let's get into it. Now, if you didn't know, forests are actually pretty cool. They're more than just trees to look at, right? Forests provide essential ecosystem services to all of the people of Earth. They clean our water. They suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and sequester it. And then in that process, they release oxygen that we breathe, the very thing that we need to live. It's good, right? They host a plethora of plants and animals and maintain biodiversity. Those are all things that I want, right? And if you didn't know, the natural regeneration of these forests is progressively impaired. That is due to a changing climate. Uh, the temperatures are warming, we're getting hotter, um, and we are in drought. We have been for a very long time. And wildfire is burning more broadly than ever before. The paper has some statistics about that. And most importantly, for reforestation, these wildfires are burning with a higher intensity and severity than before. The intensity with which fire burns is really important when you're thinking about reforestation, right? Fire is natural. It's a good thing. Catastrophic crown fire is not good. Bad. Um, this because, right, when the fire gets into the canopy and it's burning with like an incredible severity, it kills everything. Kills all the trees on the landscape. So you no longer have trees that will seed out onto the ground that will create more trees, right? You'll have these big islands of nothing. When fires get that hot and they destroy everything, they sanitize the soil. They kill everything in the soil. Now, the soil actually is a seed bank. When you go into a forest, there is a lot of seeds on the ground that are in a dormant state, just waiting for the proper conditions to come up. It's like a little cache on the ground, and when the fire burns so hot, it destroys all of that. Severe fire also creates hydrophobic soils. Uh, it's essentially renders them incapable of sucking up moisture. If you've ever, think about this, have you ever poured water into a fire pit that is out? If not, try it, right? The water doesn't seep into the soil as it would if you just dumped it on bare soil. It creates like a layer that is waterproof, essentially. And so you'll have large areas where the rain The snow does not percolate into the soil, doesn't like go into the ground. Not good for reforestation, okay? And the thing with climate change and this catastrophic fire business is that it's like this vicious feedback cycle, okay? So one of the things that we're seeing is that the bugs are as intense as they've ever been, right? Bugs love the heat. We're finding that insects are actually increasing their generation cycles. You know, they're going from having 2 generations a year to maybe 2.5, 3, right? That's critical. Okay. We are seeing that trees are becoming drought stressed. And when trees become stressed, they put off chemicals that then attracts bugs. Okay. And the bugs then kill the trees, which then creates fuel loading for these catastrophic fires. And it's this vicious cycle. Now, we already have a massive amount of land that needs to be reforested, and that will just grow in it will just grow in the demand, essentially. So currently there are 64 million acres across the United States. In the Western United States, though, I think there are 24 million acres that need to be reforested, requiring 7.5 billion seedlings with a B. That's so many. Okay, and they have this really cool table that just breaks everything down for you. I spent way too much time looking at this. They've got it by like land type. They've got how many seeds you need, how many pounds of seed. Um, it's incredible, actually, what will be required to fix it. And again, this is purely what exists. This doesn't account for the accelerated rate of deforestation. Now, when I first read this paper, this paragraph made me cringe, because this is me right here. It talks about the Forest Service and about how we are only able, it's estimated, to reforest 15 to 20% of the lands that we're responsible for each year. And this is my perspective. That's the truth. You know, on my district, I have a backlog of 400 acres, meaning that it's all been cut and it's just sitting waiting to be reforested. And at a max, I can reforest 200 to 300 acres a year. And that's purely based off of, like, you know, if I had more people, it could be more. Okay. And we're cutting at a rate of about 300 acres per year. So it's pretty much a wash. Either we're adding to the backlog or we're just like breaking even, basically. That's on my district. Other districts are completely different. Other districts have a bigger backlog and plant way more, but are kind of in the same boat where we're either adding to the backlog or we're breaking even. Okay. And why this is, it's a lot of things. I think largely it is a lack of personnel, a lack of resources being given to us. You know, we're essentially cutting at a very similar rate to what we were doing in the 80s and 90s, or we're ramping up to get there. You know, but the difference is in the 80s and the 90s, they had almost like triple the amount of people. You know, on average, a district had, you know, like 5 people, and it's just me. Like, me and my friend Sherry, okay? But it's not enough. And part of the issue is the fire and the fuels program, right? Because the firefighters, just like timber and silviculture, are operating with the bare bones amount of people that you can have. Their fire crew this year was 50%. I think normally they have like 20 people, and I think this year they had like 10, right? And there's a lot of fires that they're going out on, and then they're also responsible for coming back and doing the site prep, you know, and to do the site prep, to do the broadcast burning, to do the pile burning, or excuse me, the broadcast burning, you have to have a certain number of people. So it's like they have to call in resources, other crews who are short and busy. They have to call in those people to help, right? Um, and so, yeah, we're not getting very much burning done. And the other part of that is our burn windows are too small. There's very short periods of time that they're actually allowed to burn. So what's happening is we're not getting the burning done, and I am not allowed to replant until we do the site prep, until we do our due diligence, man, in removing the fuels on the ground. Okay, so there you go. We're not being successful, but there's a reason for that, and that was my experience. That's not in the paper. The paper talks about the Replant Act and certain legislation that's gone to help tackle the issue. I don't know much about the infrastructure law and the inflation reduction law, but I can speak on the Replant Act. Now, the Replant Act was basically just like this massive amount of money that was dedicated specifically to reforestation. And it has been nice in the regard that, like, I can write a contract for planting and the money will be there. I never have to question that. Um, but there's so many issues other than just having the money to do the contracts, right? We need so many other resources. We need personnel. And those are things that the replant doesn't necessarily touch. So it's been a good thing, but not everything. Paper talks about that. Ooh, there's a little oddball part of the paper. It talks about the carbon credit system and how that is increasing the demand for reforestation. I found this bit very interesting. I didn't think about it until I read the paper. Um, Now, this is me, not the paper. Okay. If you don't know anything about the carbon credit system, you should look into it. It's kind of an interesting concept. So, how the carbon credit system works is okay, you have a company who is emitting lots of pollution into the atmosphere, right? At some point in time, somebody said, hey, we need to charge those companies and hold them liable for their pollution. Okay. And then the companies went and said, we have an idea. What if we do projects on the ground that sequester carbon? And then because we're sequestering carbon, right, we're putting carbon back, right? It sort of negates the carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere. It balances it all out. And in theory, I mean, that kind of makes sense, right? I definitely makes sense. But in reality, what it is, big corporation who emits a lot of carbon, they go, hey, we're going to go mow down this forest. We're going to cut the big trees because they sequester carbon at a lower rate than young trees. We're going to cut all them down. And then we're going to replant new trees back, right? And we're sequestering carbon. So now we don't have to pay these large fines for our pollution. So the company wins by making money off of timber harvest, and then they win in that they don't have to completely pay out for emitting the carbon. I think it's really telling that some of the most the hugest proponents of the carbon credit system are the companies that emit carbon. I think that's one of the most telling things. Again, that's me. That's not in the paper. The paper just says these carbon credit system projects are adding to the demand of reforestation. That's what the paper says. Anywho, the reforestation pipeline begins with seeds. That may seem like an absolute no brainer, but honestly, I think that that is one of the things that is forgotten the most. Sometimes the most obvious can be overlooked. All right, so there's a study that essentially did a survey, tried to estimate how much seed like these different entities have. And across the Western United States, they found that most nurseries can only supply 4.9 and 2.2 years of conifer and hardwood seeds. So That metric is completely accurate to the institution that I work for. We essentially have 5 years of seeds um, for most conifers, and then white pine, I think, is only 2. So, and estimating the quantity of seed that you're going to need is actually quite difficult. Not all seeds are created equal. It doesn't take one seed does not equate to one seedling, right? It kind of just depends on um, the germination capacity of the seed. It can be anywhere from 1 to 6 seeds, according to this paper. And one seedling does not equate to one tree on the landscape either, right? We plant a lot of trees and not all of them survive, right? So it's hard to plan just in general how much seed you're going to need. And then it's really difficult to plan the logistics behind that. Now, um, how different land management entities manage the land, it's very different. It varies. Okay, so like how the goals of management for private withholdings is completely different than how the state does it, and it's the state is different than how the Forest Service does it, and even within the entities, that management can change. For example, historically, the Forest Service has been very like timber harvest centered, right? The way that we reforest is based off of what species can we put back that is going to grow quickly and make a really good board. And we've kind of transitioned away from that. We're a little more concerned about maintaining like the genetic integrity, species diversity. It's more of an ecosystem type thing. We still have timber management goals in our reforestation. Um, right. So it's like planning seed procurement is based off of the mission and objective of the land management entity, and those vary broadly. So coming up with a plan for everybody that works for everybody is going to be very difficult. That's what this section of the paper talks about. They've got a really cool graphic here. I also spent way too much time looking at this. I hung it up in my cube. It's a good one. If you have time, just take a gander. So the first thing that the paper talks about is we need to create an inventory across all of the land management entities, tribal, state, federal, private. Like we need to figure out how much seed we have across all of those entities. That's the first thing it calls for. They want to know who has access to these inventories, and who's taking what, essentially. And then through this, you can identify specific species or elevation bands where we're hurting the most, right? Basically, this whole part of the paper talks about we need to take an inventory, we need to make a plan. Um, talks about how most private entities don't publish their internal seed withholdings, and even like the state won't. Really, the Forest Service is by law mandated to report. We have to report everything that we do, which is one of the hardest aspects of my job. Like my job would be so much more simple if I didn't have to report everything, every little thing I do. Okay. But so the paper talks about how there's a lack of transparency. It talks about how the federal government won't share their seeds, and that's true. We are not allowed to share our seeds with anybody so that we don't influence the seed market. It would be unfair that way. And the paper calls for maybe ending that. But the truth is, this is me, not the paper. The truth is, I don't think we even really have any seed to share, to be quite honest. So it talks about how like these types of inventories have made before. There's apparently like a native plant species inventory that they do kind of the same thing. Um, Up here is where it gets into the nitty gritty of it. They want to create an inventory and make a plan, right? And they want to make this plan off of um, projecting where the seed need is going to be the largest. So essentially looking at various climate models and like bug models where there are areas that are more likely to have mass deforestation, right? Find those areas, figure out what we need to reforest in those areas, like specific seed zones or species where we're lacking, and making a more targeted effort at getting what we need. Because I don't think, this is me, we're going to need a lot, and I'm not sure that we're going to get it all. So, picking the highest priority areas. Now, the Forest Service made a plan to do this. This paper came out in 2023, and the Forest Service had actually made plans to do this, where we're going to use climate projections and vulnerability analyses to pick highest priorities and focus on that. But this was in 2023, and the climate has, not the actual climate, the political climate has shifted rapidly. This is me, not the paper. We've gotten emails that are essentially like, do not even mention climate change. So I don't know what the status of, this plan is. Seed sourcing in a changing climate. This is by far the most complex bit of the whole deal. We're reforesting with a moving target. And that can be difficult. So the paper gets at, we need to be thinking about how are things going to be changed and how do we make informed decisions in that change, right? There's models that exist for various species that sort of predict how is the species going to move across the landscape? Where is it contracting? Where is it expanding? Can we target the areas where there's the contraction bit, right? Where it's going to disappear first, essentially. Talks about how we need to focus on species with a low genetic variation or are just not good at perpetuating themselves across the landscape. The species that just essentially need the most help. This entire left side of the paper kind of gets at, I guess this entire page actually gets at assisted migration. And if you don't know, assisted migration is kind of a hot topic in forestry, at least in America. In Canada, they have already, in 2022, they created a climate-based seed transfer system that they're implementing within their forestry realm, right? They did that in 2022. In America, we're still fighting over it. So, assisted migration, I'm going to do my best to try and explain this. This can be kind of a hard thing to explain. Assisted migration is essentially taking seed and moving it so it's still viable in today's climate, but it's also going to be viable in the future climate, right? The way that seed zones work is we've basically created a system where we know if you harvest seeds from this tree, you can move it some distance up or down and the tree will be fine there. We've created these bands, these rules of like, you have this tree here at 3,000 feet, you can move it here and you can move it there and it will be fine. Okay. We've created these seed bands, but in the future they will not necessarily be the same. Okay. And these seed bands also only exist for species that are important for timber harvest. There's so many other trees like cedar and stuff that we just don't operationally do frequently that don't have this information at all. That's one of the problems that they talk about in the paper, right? So the idea of assisted migration is to take, say you have this area to reforest at whatever elevation, you would take seed that that is more adapted to warmer than the spot that you want to reforest, right? And you're going to put it on that site. And it's kind of the leading edge of where it's comfortable, where it is gonna do well and survive, but it is in all reality adapted to a warmer climate, right? So that as the climate warms, the trees at that elevation will be good. Hopefully, you understand what I'm talking about. I've never tried to explain assisted migration before, right? Um, and the Forest Service has made a plan, talks about this in here, where the Forest Service had established a plan to start looking at assisted migration and how we can incorporate it into our operations. Um, and they were doing it in a bunch of different places: California, Oregon, Washington. They had a bunch of different people who were collaborating on the project. Um, they were trying to incorporate it into things we were already doing. So it's like, it's expensive, right? It's research. That's how it goes. You have to pay a lot of money to get information. But they were trying to incorporate it into things that we were already doing. So, like massive burn areas that have to be artificially reforested. They were trying to um, use that as an opportunity to start looking at assisted migration stuff. Again, I don't know what um, the fate of those programs are, but we were doing it at one point in time. Seed collection and procurement. That is my favorite part. Now, there's two places to get seeds: orchards and in the woods. Orchards have distinct advantages over woods run collections um, because they're in a controlled environment. You know, you can water them, you can fertilize them, you can create higher quality seed that way. You can also stimulate the production of cones, right? There's different methods that you can do that. Where in the woods, you're kind of just at the mercy of Mother Nature, whether or not the trees are going to put off cone that year. It is way easier, I can confirm this, to harvest from seed orchards than it is from woods run collections, right? The trees in seed orchards tend to be younger, healthier. Um, I never get up in a orchard tree and worry about things being rotted. Um, they're generally not as tall, and most of the times you can just drive a bucket truck straight down the row and pick that way. Most often, seed orchards are built in tandem with a genetic tree improvement program. So the trees that are there are selected based off of traits that are advantageous for something, right? Historically, those traits have been, again, centered on timber harvest, right? So a lot of the times the traits will be focused on, um, volume, taper, basically traits that create more wood in a shorter period of time. Okay. Um, and the paper right here talks about, how we need to transition from building seed orchards with timber harvest in mind to perhaps building seed orchards with the changing climate in mind. So, selecting for traits that preserve ecological functioning and adaptive capacity. Let's select for traits that um, have to do with drought and temperature tolerance, or perhaps phenology, right? When the trees break bud or set bud, right? Because trees, their entire metabolic process is so dependent on environmental cues, right? We should look at the traits behind those cues to kind of get at what are we gonna do as the climate changes. Okay. And that's really where I nerd out about, is the building of seed orchards specifically with climate change in mind. So the thing with seed orchards is that it takes a substantial investment financially and also time wise. It takes, you know, lots of money, and even if you're getting everything in the orchard, you got it all cooking, it's going to be a decade before it starts pumping out seeds. Really, one of the only disadvantages, I think, of the seed orchard. And seed orchards really only supply half of what we need currently. That's where this talks about down here. Um, Really, we only get about half of the amount of seed that we need from seed orchards. And so for the rest of it, we're dependent on woods run collection. So we just go out in the woods and collect from trees there. Um, Wood run collections are very difficult to coordinate. I can confirm that. um, Historically, one of the things that they've done is collect from squirrel caches, where you basically just walk around and you look to see where the squirrels have been ripping the cones apart and you figure out where they stored the seeds. Back in the day, they did that all the time. Um, Forest Service will not do that now, right? Because you don't know the genetic composition of the seeds, right? It could be a bunch of seeds from maybe two trees, and then if you reforest with that, you're essentially planting a bunch of siblings and cousins, um, and you're not maintaining like a broad enough genetic diversity there with the squirrel caches. You don't know for sure. There's also a lot of fungus involved with the seeds laying on the forest floor for a while, and I know that like from a nursery perspective, it can be kind of difficult to get those seeds to grow. So squirrel caches is an option, but I don't think people do that really anymore, at least not like at a large scale operational level. Um, the next option would be to collect from felling trees. And we have been doing that this year just because we are completely out of seed and it's almost like a necessary evil at this point. Um, this is not in the paper. This is me. I get real sensitive about this because, again, there are certain elevation bands that are just so important looking forward, predominantly the low ones. And once you cut a mature tree, yes, a tree will pop up in its place. But not all trees are created equal. Again, this is me, not the paper. Um, the vegetative material at the tippy top of the tree is of critical importance, right? Because that's what you take to form an orchard. You take that material and you graft it, and that's how you form an orchard. And if we remove all of the vegetation material at certain levels, it's going to be very difficult to start orchards for certain elevation bands. So I'm about filling operations as long as they're in elevation bands that aren't critically important. Again, that's me and not in the paper. um, and filling operations are just, again, from personal experience, very difficult to coordinate, right? Because one of the things that we tried to do was harvest from trees that are going to be cut anyways, that are in a timber sale. But those trees, coordinating with the loggers can be difficult because they just want to drop them and then haul them out. They don't want you in there picking one day, and it can be kind of difficult to coordinate the harvest when the trees are actually ready to seed out. That's the other thing. So, but filling operations are an option. Um, and then the last woods run collection option would be to just climb the trees and collect the seed that way. And um, I think most institutions, perhaps not the state, the Forest Service for sure, we will do in-house seed collections where it's just all Forest Service people that go and collect. And again, that's kind of limited because of the personnel thing. I mean, like 2 years ago, we had like 20 climbers, and now we're down to like 7. You know what I mean? Like on my forest. The in-house collections are a thing, but that's limited at this time. Um, and I think most institutions actually contract out the climbing, but that is limited due to a shortage of skilled labor. Um, for Region 1, where I work, there exists 6 contractors, basically to cover all of Montana, north central Idaho, I think a little bit of the Dakota, and then maybe a little Wyoming. I'm not sure. It's a huge chunk of land, and there's 6 contractors. Um, and I've experienced where you could put together an entire collection contract, and do all of the work going into that, which is a lot, which I'll get into later in the paper. But um, where you work hard, you put all of this together, and it's possible that no one would even open the documents or put a bid on your contract. That has happened before. Okay. Um, just because the contractors would rather go climb big beautiful Ponderosa in western Montana over climbing Larch in central Idaho. Like, it's just an easier, you know, better climb in Montana, Ponderosa. Anyways, so there are limitations to the climbing bit and the contractual getting people to actually do it. They did a survey where they asked, like a bunch of people from different management entities, like what are the issues with uh, cone collection. Um, and the things that they talked about. So they basically did a survey and they said, like, what are the biggest things of concern for you in terms of seed procurement? And this is what they said: lack of clarity around tree seed demand. True. Again, that's like, you would think that that would be the first thing that you would plan for, but it's often the thing that is forgotten the most. I would say that that is true within my institution as well. Limited capacity for scouting potential collection sites. Yes. There's only so much. Again, I can't speak for everybody, but for me, there's only so much that one person can do. Cone, recon, and getting the contract put together and the collection, that requires almost like one person to just solely focus on that. And it's like, I have other things that I have to do, other, contracts that I have to supervise, and other surveying that I need to do. Um, Finding the cones can be difficult. You have to cover a lot of ground, and, you need people for that. Difficulty with permitting. I have never had issues with that. I'm not quite sure exactly what that means. I don't know enough about other institutions to know exactly what the permitting process would be. And then a limited professional labor pool. Again, like, you can write the contracts, but that doesn't mean that there are going to be climbers, businesses that can come and do the work for you. Poor communication between collectors and seed buyers as key bottlenecks. Okay, so um, again, that one's not super, doesn't pertain to me because we have all of our in house. We do all of our seed stuff in house and we don't share. But communication between the collectors and seed buyers is one thing that they identified as an issue. Predicting demand and improving pre collection scouting. This section is really just about how it can be difficult to find the seeds. Um, cones reaching full maturity and being able to be harvested is highly dependent on environmental factors: how much rain we got, how the temperature's been, um, the location in general, and then trees mast. So they'll have years where they put off a lot of seed and then they kind of dip down, and then 7 years later they'll put off a lot of seeds and they'll dip down, and the amount of time between the masting is different for every species. And so it can be difficult as a forester to go out and know where to look. And you kind of have to be cognizant of all of these things. Is it going to be a good Ponderosa year, or is it going to be a good Larch year? And then you focus your attention on whatever species specifically. But again, it can be kind of hard to get to that place. Scouting is one of the hardest parts, right? Because, for me specifically, from the time that the snow melts to the time that I have to submit the documents for the contract, it's like a month. And then once you find a good collection and you get it under contract, you have to constantly be going up and checking the trees, because just because there are pine cones does not mean that there is seed in it. You have to go up, chop the cones, confirm that there are seeds in the cones, right? And then after you've confirmed that, you've put it under contract, you've got a contractor lined up, You got to be climbing up, checking to make sure that the crop doesn't disappear. You could lose a crop to insects. I had one year where all of the cones were ripped out of the tree by a big windstorm. And then you have all of this information and you have to be in communication with the contractors, and that can be a very difficult thing. In the paper, it talks about how, you know, you could potentially have the contractors show up and perhaps the collection's gone or something went awry, and then the contractors don't get paid. The Forest Service has actually put in place mechanisms to make sure that the contractors, they still get paid whether or not the crop is there at the end of the year. But they could be climbing other trees, doing other collections. So it's important to have that communication of like, hey, what's going on, right? And it can be difficult. That's what the paper talks about. I can confirm. On this side, the right side, it talks about um, permitting and land access to streamlined collections. Now, this is mostly talking about uh, small collectors who will get a permit through whatever agency, whatever type of public land that they're dealing with. And then they'll go out and do these small collections. But the paper talks about how, you know, these people are primarily focused on, it's like more of an opportunistic thing, right? They are just trying to make some money. They're not necessarily focused on what is it that we need, species or elevation band wise. They could be collecting from squirrel caches. The paper talks about how it's essential, we need that to aid in reforestation, the collection of seeds, but perhaps that type of collection could add to the complexity of it, because again, you don't know if they're collecting from squirrel caches or not. There's no verification to like there's no verification of what elevation band. You're kind of just dependent on what they bring to you, which they could come with zero information in a bag of seed, and that could make things more complex. So it basically talks about having like a seed verification system where the collector verifies the information of the collection. In this section, it talks about coordinating those independent collectors and professionally trained collectors, right? Bringing everybody together to work together so that more seed is collected, but making it targeted to areas that we actually need, to species that we actually need. So this part is about having more cooperation between independent and professional collectors. And then this section is about having coordinated collections between agencies, right? Having the state work with the feds, coordinating our efforts, or, different entities in that way. And then the paper goes on to list a couple operations where they did that and it was actually successful. Collection, labor, training, and communication. Now, every step of the process requires this little bundle of knowledge for each person, right? As a forester, I need to know and understand the phenology, the botany aspect of what's going on, right? I need to understand, like, if I crack a cone open, what does a mature, good seed look like? You know, when do we harvest, right? If you harvest cones too early, the seed is of poor quality. If you wait too long, it'll all just spill out on the ground. And knowing, when the appropriate time is to harvest, like that's all comes through training and experience. Uh, the tree climbers, the contract people that come out and climb for us, that's a very specific trade. It's a very specific skill set. And I think that the training to teach people that doesn't come by very often. The people who process the seed, They need to know a lot as well, right? And there's generally, this is what the paper talks about, a lack of training in all of those things. It talks about how even in traditional forestry classes, you know, there's a lack there of what to do when it comes to s- seed procurement. And I can agree with that. I mean, we covered seeds in my reforestation class, but it wasn't enough. I think that you could actually do an entire standalone class um, just on that specifically. So the paper talks about how do we get more training, right? It talks about having expanding university courses. It talks about um, workforce development, getting more skilled professionals into the mix. Post collection handling. It is critically important. The time period from when the cones are removed to when they get to the nursery to be processed. Seeds are living, respirating organisms that are sensitive to temperature, to fungus. So, how you package those seeds and how you transport them to the nursery or the seed extractory is critically important. And that is really influential on the quality of the seed. That's what this section talks about. Once it actually makes it to the extractory, again, that takes a whole bunch of knowledge to know what to do, right? Because it's different for every species. How you get the seeds out of the cone, how you actually store it is dependent again on the species. It takes a lot of specialized equipment. They need Whoever is doing the extraction again needs to know the biology of the species, um, and it is a critical part of the process. Once seed is actually preserved, it can be stored at low temperatures for years. We are the Forest Service is we have a rule that if it's past 15, we're not supposed to use it, but we are currently using seed that is 30 years old and it is still doing great. So there you go. This part of the paper talks about seed extractories. Since 2005, we have lost 19% um, of our extractory capacity. And that's due largely to budget cuts to federal and state forestry programs. For my region specifically, we have one extractory. It's the Coeur d'Alene Nursery. And they do all of the seed for the Forest Service in this region. Also, Region 6, so it's a massive area that they're covering for Forest Service. That extractory also does the tribal extracts for the tribes, and it also extracts for the state, I believe. Don't quote me on the state bit. And it is one guy. There's one guy in there extracting all of the seed for ton, a ton of cones. It really is impressive. And this part of the paper talks about how we need to invest in that infrastructure, um, particularly because the Forest Service extractory, we have that, and we can serve the tribe and the state, and we can do multiple regions. But it kind of leaves out private. Where do the private landowners extract their seed, and where do they store it? And private land ownership accounts for 50% of what needs to be reforested. So that's what the paper talks about here is a need for expanding that infrastructure and serving the private landowners as well. Seed testing and certification. Knowing the quality of the seed is very important when it comes to planning, right? As a forester, you need to know the germination rate so that you can figure out how many seedlings do I actually have? How many more do I need? The germination rate is also very important for the nursery people so that they can sow the correct number of seeds so that they don't sell themselves short and not grow enough trees. And it also helps prevent them from oversowing or wasting seed. Most agencies, they do in-house testing and they figure out that information. However, um, private entities a lot of the times will not do that because there's an extra cost to that. And so the paper talks about how we need to ensure that all of the seed goes through some verification process where we know where it came from on the landscape, how it was collected, and then its quality. And so that's what this section of the paper talks about, is making sure that we have all of that information so that we can make informed decisions. Having a certification process essentially that ensures that you get that information. Access and distribution, it again brings up this idea of the federal seed reserves are designated for federal use only. And this part of the paper talks about how we need to end that. We need to open up federal seed reserves to everybody else, because what is happening is the agencies are more or less taking care of themselves, but the public entities, the public, the people who privately own their land, they don't have access to seed. And so the paper talks about how opening the federal seed reserve would help the um, the private stakeholders have access to that material. Um, Especially since they account for like 50% of what needs to be reforested. So it's like only 50% of what needs to be reforested actually has access to the material to reforest. And so the thing that the paper recommends is, let's share the federal seeds. But I can attest that we're going to need more seeds for that. Funding, communication, and collaboration. This section of the paper just talks about how we need to collaborate, you know, between the stakeholders, between private, public, industry. Now, before I get to the conclusion, take a second to pause and look at this visual. This is a good one. I got lost in this for a while. This just visually shows everything that it talked about in this paper. And I think it does well in showing how complex everything is. There's so many moving parts to all of this. So please take a second to pause and look at this. Now, the paper just so conveniently put all of the major points into bullets here at the end, and I'm going to read those to you. This is what the paper identifies as the things that we absolutely need to do to tackle the reforestation, the issues that exist. So, first and foremost, conduct a national assessment of forest tree seed inventory across jurisdictional boundaries. We need to make an inventory. Compile a publicly accessible shared database and identify gaps in the national seed inventory. We need to see where we're falling short, which species, which elevation bands. It goes on to say that we need to prioritize strategic collections based on climate change impacts in species or population vulnerabilities. We need to make an informed plan. We have an inventory, we know where we're short, we need to make an informed plan. We need to improve seed orchard production and capacity and scope. And that's what I totally nerd out about. 100%. We need to do that. We need money to do that. All right. Assess capacity and investment into seed collection, cleaning, and storage infrastructure and training. Yes. We need to establish coordinated funding, labor resources, and access to reforestation plant materials across jurisdictions. Before this paper, it never actually occurred to me that, huge portions of the stakeholders who could reforest don't actually have access to the material at all, which is concerning. So we need to do that. And last but not least, we need to ensure communication feedback loops among the entire reforestation pipeline. True. Because like all of these little entities are very specialized and they're very focused on what it is that they do. Um, and not often do we just sit down together and talk with each other. So definitely, we need to speak to each other. So thank you if you have made it this far. I know this was a long one. I really appreciate you being here. And I hope that you have gathered some useful information from this. So thank you. Thank you to all of the people who put this paper together. You guys are the real heroes. Thank you for bringing awareness to the topic, and um, please continue to do what it is that you do.